Well, I guess because we have a full program today, we really appreciate your showing up and joining us. Happy New Year. I think we're still allowed to say that for another few days here. My name is Risa Shimoda, and I'm the Executive Director of the River Management Society. And others who are going to be joining and presenting today will introduce themselves in a moment. But welcome to Considering Climate Refugia as an outstandingly remarkable value on wild and scenic rivers. We'll be hearing from Charles Drimal from the Greater Yellowstone Coalition and Michael Fiebig from American Rivers. So thanks again for joining us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Angie Furman, and I'm the River Training Center Coordinator for RMS. And thank you for joining us for the first River Management Roundtable of 2023. For those who might not be familiar, River Management Roundtables, we're going to be hosting this year once a month on the second Tuesday of each month. And really just trying to have some great discussion around some of these topics. And so we'll be having some time for some Q&A today. You're also welcome to put any thoughts into the chat if you want to not forget them. But we'll be monitoring the chat and have time for people to ask questions and come off mute and whatnot. But just to let you know, these roundtables, they're open to river managers, stewards, water trail managers, leaders, planners, people who are working on and for rivers. And so thank you all for being here today. You might have seen a notification when you came in. We are recording this, and we'll be emailing out a link to the recording as well as have it available on our YouTube channel afterwards. But I just wanted to review a quick couple norms and agreements for today. Really just about respecting one another and then contributing to the process and allowing everyone to be heard, speaking for yourself. You can see them here. So thank you all. And now I'd like to, you've already met Risa and myself, so I'd like to pass it over to Mike and Charles to introduce themselves.
Thanks, Angie, and thanks, Risa. Appreciate you both having us here today, and thank you all for joining us. This is going to be a good discussion. My name is Mike Fiebig. I know a lot of you as looking as people were coming in, so it's nice to see familiar faces. I work for American Rivers. I direct our river protection program for the Southwest U.S., based in Durango, Colorado. And been at American Rivers for over 11 years, which is kind of crazy to say. And I've done a lot of wild and scenic work. And first, I worked up in the Northern Rockies with Charles. So that's how we came to know one another. We were colleagues up there and are still friends and ski partners and other things too. For those who don't know American Rivers, I'm assuming everyone does here, but American Rivers is a national conservation organization. We were founded 50 years ago this year. This is our 50th anniversary. And our mission is to protect wild rivers, restore damaged and degraded rivers, and conserve clean water for people and nature. You'll probably see a new logo from us this year. You'll actually see it in this presentation in celebration of our 50th, and cheers to another 50 years. So thanks for having me today.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Risa and Angie of River Management Society for having us. My name is Charles Drimal. I'm the Deputy Director of Conservation at the Greater Yellowstone Coalition. It's great to see a bunch of familiar names on the screen. For those who don't know the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, we work to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of the 20 million acre Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which includes lands within Southwest and South Central Montana, Northwest Wyoming, and Eastern Idaho. It's also the ancestral homelands of dozens of tribes, including Shoshone, Crow, Blackfeet, Arapaho, and many more. I focus my work in two of our conservation priorities, one on addressing the impacts of climate change within the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and two, focusing on tribal conservation and culture in the region, and both have a lot of overlap with water and with wild and scenic rivers. So We're really excited to be here to talk about the nexus of climate refugia. Similar to Mike, I've worked on a lot of wild and scenic river policy over the years. I've worked for GYC for 12 years now and started working with Mike on the Shoshone National Forest on wild and scenic river eligibility, and have since worked on eligibility on the Custer-Gallatin National Forest, and I'm actively working on the Bridger-Teton National Forest, as well as policy, working with Mike on East Rosebud Creek, passing Montana's first wild and scenic river bill in over 42 years, and then currently working on the Montana Headwaters Legacy Act. All of this eligibility work and policy work has an important nexus with climate change. So really excited to share with Mike some of our concepts around climate refugia as an ORV on wild and scenic rivers. Thank you, Mike.
All right, next slide, please. Oh, this one's perfect. So thanks, Charles. So Charles and I split up the presentation, but we went through the whole thing together. We've been working on this for a while. First, as Charles mentioned, up in the Northern Rockies, and then when I came down here to the Southwest with some of the forests and BLM planning offices down here. We're going to run through and make the case for climate refugia, and then as outstandingly remarkable values, and then also go into some of kind of the management prescriptions that we think might be useful. And we'll probably run through it in about 20 minutes or so. And the hope is that we have a robust conversation at the end, and we have a couple questions to kick that off. So what we hope to get from you all as active listeners are some really good questions and discussion topics as to how we might be able to implement this thing farther down the line. Next slide, please. All right, so this isn't going to be news to anyone. The need for addressing climate impacts and protecting climate refugia is great, you know, and basically rivers, and especially intact rivers that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act deals with on public lands, fit this really well. As we know, climate change is largely hydrologic change, and that some of our rivers and freshwater ecosystems will be most greatly impacted by climate change. And we know their importance too, as detailed in some of the data that's up on the screen. And at the same time, we know that so many of them have been degraded. You know, species have declined 83%, you know, freshwater mammal, bird, and reptile species, 1970 to 2014. Freshwater fish have declined in the same period by 76%, and 75% of all land habitat areas have degraded over the same time period. So what we're really talking about are, you know, these key linchpins in ecosystems that we need to weather the worst impacts of climate change in the future. Next slide, please. It's a very dense slide. It's so I won't read all of this, but it's some great, again, something that's not going to be unfamiliar to folks. It's some great data published by Adaptation Partners, of which the Forest Service is partner in. And basically it reinforces that view that climate change in so many ways is going to be hydrologic and watershed change. It's also going to stress and impact species, avian, mammal, freshwater fish species in an outsized way. So basically what we're proposing here is that that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act fits this perfectly, right? Like we're talking about a lot of our suite of outstandingly remarkable values that we deal with in Wild and Scenic fits this really well. Next slide, please. So some of you may have been wondering, what are climate refugia? Coming up with a definition, which we can, of course, amend, and you all can help us amend in the future. But this is the one we're using right now. They're areas that remain relatively buffered from contemporary climate change over time and enable persistence of valued physical, ecological, and socio-cultural resources, including critical habitat and migration corridors. So basically, climate refugia are pieces of habitat, in this case, since we're talking about wild and scenic rivers, along rivers, that help mitigate droughts, floods, disease, temperatures, wildfires, conditions that are exacerbated or caused by climate change. And we believe that climate refugia would really help us adhere to the precautionary principle. So if we try to protect areas of value, either for flows or temperature, a number of other pieces that we'll explain later on, we'll be using the precautionary principle for our fish, wildlife, and plant habitats into the future. Next, please. All right, down to the nitty-gritty. So we're assuming that most of you, hopefully nearly all of you that joined this presentation, are very familiar with Wild and Scenic. If not, you probably know the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. It was passed in 1968 to protect the most outstanding, kind of last best intact free-flowing rivers in the country. It's the preeminent river protection law for free-flowing rivers in the United States. So part of this, of course, is this suite of outstandingly remarkable values that are protected along with free-flowing character and water quality. So basically, an outstandingly remarkable value, they're unique to every river section that's designated or are found to be eligible or suitable under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And they must be river related of or owing to their existence in the river, and they must be rare, unique, or exemplary features that are significant at a regional or national scale. And we'll talk about region of comparison later. These values, once they're inventoried or designated on public lands, enjoy a maintain or enhance standard over the life of the designation. And they provide a lot of flexibility. So the Act says, you know, as was written in 68, lists common outstandingly remarkable values, scenery, fisheries, wildlife, recreation. But there's also this category of other similar values. And this other category has been used in the past for a number of different values, ranging from ecology to there's even a literary ORV for the Concord River. There's a lot of flexibility there. We think that climate refugia or something similar fits into this other category very well. So unlike some of our other designations on public lands or other protective laws or administrative overlays, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act does provide this flexibility. And lucky for us, it provides flexibility regarding an ecosystem type that is under threat by climate change. Next, please. All right, so a couple maps here, but I think the important part of this is that, you know, in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, there's a region of comparison. So what makes a value outstandingly remarkable? And what it is that it must be outstandingly remarkable within its region of comparison. And that's usually unique to each value. What we're arguing here, and hopefully we can discuss this in the Q&A some too, that because this is a national crisis, the climate crisis, it deserves a national region of comparison, or at least a large region of comparison. We've got a couple different overlays up there, water resource regions, the Northwest temperature scale, which we should note, temperature isn't the only thing that makes a climate refugia outstanding. Persistence of temperature. For instance, warm water streams and stream habitat types, their outstanding value or outstanding characteristics that would make climate refugia could be connectivity, it could be flows that will persist over time. Either way, we'd like to argue that and part of this is the strategy of that we need all of the intact habitat and resilient habitat that we've got to stay that way through the climate crisis in order to have a chance of coming through the other side. So, for instance, when Charles and I were talking about this, we said, you know, there are lots of places in the Intermountain West that you could say, well, this whole area is climate refugia, you know, the high altitude around the greater Yellowstone Plateau, for instance. Well, that shouldn't limit its characterization as an outstandingly remarkable value, considering when we look at the entire United States, areas that are going to weather climate change are going to be relatively rare. Next slide, please. I'm going to pass it over to Charles here.
Thanks, Mike. So we feel like there's a lot of authorization to move forward with climate refugia as an ORV. And we just want to pull apart a few different pieces of that authorization. So first, we have the science that backs this. And I think Mike and I are incredibly indebted to Dan Isaac and company. And Dan Isaac and company represents literally hundreds of hydrologists across the American West that have done data sampling as well as modeling around cold water climate refugia for native fish. They've mapped this out, and I'll show you that in a couple of slides. But this really, just seeing this visually was real inspiration that there are clear areas. If we just want to look at temperature as an indicator, there are clear areas of climate refugia that agencies really need to take a close look at for climate refugia. Then there's adaptation partners, which Mike had mentioned in an earlier slide. There's the Rocky Mountain Research Station. There's many climate assessments that have been conducted, some by tribes, others by states, one most recently within the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem itself by the USGS, University of Wyoming, Montana State University, and GYC. We have a lot of science to back this work. Now, on top of that, we have in the Biden administration executive orders as well as secretarial orders. I think everybody by now on this presentation who's participating here, either live or listening afterwards, is familiar with the America the Beautiful 30 by 30 initiative, which was a key part of Biden's executive order 1408, tackling the climate crisis at home. If you look really closely, there is a section 216 on conserving our nation's lands and waters. And that section itself is basically asking agencies to take a hard look at solutions and coming up with innovative solutions for supporting climate resilience and adaptation. And again, you know, I think that climate refugia as an ORV and this Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is an adaptive tool that can be a part of the solution. We also have secretarial order or many secretarial orders, including agency directives. And I just want to highlight one, which is Secretarial Memorandum 1077, Climate Resilience and Carbon Stewardship of America's National Forests and Grasslands. The quote that comes from the early part of that: attaining our global climate goals cannot be achieved in the absence of investments and policies to secure healthy and climate resilient forests. We already have a policy in place, which is the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. It just needs to be adapted to this new context of climate change and protecting climate refugia. Next slide, please. So within the secretarial memorandum, there is a pretty large section on many actions related to this topic. And one of them is on integration with planning. So for anyone who's with the Forest Service or BLM listening in, I think this applies really well to inventories and eligibility. So the quote from that says, develop recommendations for methods to incorporate new analyses and data and the use of new and innovative tools and technology to ensure climate resilience and carbon stewardship considerations are integrated into forest and relevant project planning. For land management planning, and I think this needs to be emphasized, this should include recommendations for how to support the explicit consideration of carbon stewardship optimization and climate adaptation in defining desired conditions. Again, I think this is authorization to use existing policy to protect climate refugia. Next slide, please. So I'd mention our gratitude to Dan Isaac and all for his work on Climate Shield Coldwater Refugia. If you aren't familiar with this, please take a look at the website. The focus is on the persistence of cold water streams for native trout, particularly bull trout and cutthroat trout across the American West. Besides the immense data collection that exists, and as I mentioned before, hundreds of people who are involved in this, they just did such an excellent job of making this visually usable, and there's shape files that you can use to help inform your work in watersheds that you're working on. And it was broken down from, like, just as an example of this screenshot here, the dark blue represents streams that are least likely to hybridize by the year 2040, the green and yellow more likely. And so already you can start to parse out just by temperature alone some of the most important streams for native fish. And again, I just want to emphasize that what we're talking about with climate refugia as an ORV is different than what we might talk about as native fish as an ORV, where it's more a focus on existing populations and conservation. Next slide, please. And one of the reasons for that is that we feel really strongly that climate refugia is not solely about cold water temperatures. It also speaks to connectivity for species. It speaks to habitat persistence, the ability for big game migration, or for species who move across large distances. It speaks to water quantity, areas where there's considerable amount of water or water storage, and then water quality as well. Next slide, please. I think, there we go, thanks. So there's 4 places where this work can be implemented. I think I alluded to eligibility inventories, as did Mike. So this is, work done often as part of land management planning. This is work Mike and I have pushed for with various forests and some BLM. There's suitability determinations that can happen where the climate refugia ORV can be considered after streams have already been deemed eligible. During the writing of comprehensive river management plans, after rivers have already been designated as wild and scenic, there's an opportunity there to look at climate refugia. And then last, integrating this work into future handbooks and guidance documents for agencies. Next slide, please. I think this is another one of those slides that has a lot of text, so apologies, but for me, it's actually one of the most exciting slides. And the reason here is I feel like it's at least a step in the direction of laying out a framework for how to do this. So Mike and I are, we get giddy to share this, and of course thinking of it as just a concept, but at least an approach. So the 2 main components here are inventories and maintenance and management. So just looking at inventorying, so what would this involve? of course, what's most obvious and what we've talked about probably the most is looking at clean, cold, copious water. But beyond that, it also needs to include intact riparian areas, snow sheds where there's existing glaciers, there's perhaps year-round snowfields where you have favorable north aspect. It should include springs and seeps that address persistent groundwater and infiltration. And then getting beyond just that hydrological context, we need to look at persistent habitat for native fish, for beaver, for birds, ungulates, predators, aquatic and riparian dependent species, and there are many. And then, as I mentioned in an earlier slide, migration corridors in so many places, not everywhere, but in so many places, follow these riparian zones, and these riparian zones that are climate refugia provide cover, habitat, food sources that are essential to the future survival of these species, especially in a changing climate. And then another component of this, and I think that like we can all relate to the communities that we live in, is that there is a human piece here. Human populations depend on water that's going to last long into the future. And so for both municipal uses and for agricultural uses, we encourage agencies to look at streams that are serving communities downstream, even if they're starting up in headwaters on public lands. So that's the first part. And the second component of this is maintenance and enhancement of climate resilient features. So if a project is proposed, let's say in theory we have an agency that protects a stream or a series of streams as climate refugia as an ORV. So if a project is proposed, then the agency should make sure that water quality is maintained, floodplains and riparian ecology are intact in the face of that proposed project. Shade, cover, upland forests and riparian areas are intact. It could also be an area to emphasize invasive species removal. Certainly a place to maintain flows, which is part of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. A place to consider projects that support natural water storage. Thinking about, the calculation of carbon sequestration, carbon storage in that landscape. And then, of course, just mitigating any threats that would impact the overall climate refugia of that landscape. Next slide, please.
Something really quickly before we go past there, Charles.
Yeah.
Because I know we were going to both talk about this next one. So could you go back, Angie, please? So something that Charles and I are arguing that some of you are probably asking yourself, well, why don't regular outstandingly remarkable values cover this? We have remarkable ORVs for fish, for wildlife, for recreation, for ecology, for on and on. I think something that we're arguing is that in areas of climate refugia, any one of those values taken alone might not meet the bar of outstandingly remarkable value. But when taken together in the package of climate refugia, they very well could. So for instance, Dan Isaac's work, which we are looking at above, looks at both cold water persistence and genetic purity persistence. And so the highest level of streams in Climate Shield have both of those things. They have persistence of cold water predicted through 2040 and persistence of genetic purity for native trout species through 2040 as well. So I just wanted to be clear about that and in that way, for those of us who love rivers, this is also a way to help protect some of those values that might not meet the ORV bar alone, but when put into a package that allows humans and wildlife, and fish and birds to adapt to climate change over the long term, they're outstandingly remarkable value. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. And actually, that's a really great segue into this slide. Mike and I wanted to share just some examples of where we've so far attempted to integrate this work in about the last decade. And I just want to start by saying, one place that really speaks to your your point, Mike, is on the Custer Gallatin, where we looked at, you know, if we were just to take a look at Dan Isaac's climate shield, there's, as Mike mentioned, there's many streams on the Custer Gallatin National Forest that fit that model. But when we also combine that model with migration paths for big game, or for really important habitat and cover for grizzly bears, then all of a sudden we were able to say, okay, well, here on when we combine factors, it's very clear that some of these riparian corridors meet an extremely high standard and high bar as outstandingly remarkable, and are associated with, or those watersheds are associated with climate refugia. So over the years, you know, there's a list here. I don't know if it's about maybe eight different national forests. I think I said in the introduction that we started working on this on the Shoshone National Forest, which included its forest plan around 2013. Not always under the name Climate Refugia, but
I think you
I
froze.
think that's where we Custer Gallatin and Bridger Teton more recently, which is an active forest plan. I'll pass it over to Mike if my internet connection is bad right now.
Awesome. Thanks, Charles. Yeah, we've got a number of forests on here that we've weighed in on with Climate Refugia in one shape or form. And we've listed the ones that are active and then the ones that are that have already passed. I should note that none of these forests have yet fully embraced Climate Refugia. We do see things that touch on something very close as an ORV, like ecology, potentially some of the reasoning behind, say, a botany ORV, but not yet Climate Refugia. So we still have the opportunity in these ones that are active: the Ashley National Forest, the Lincoln, the Bridger Teton, the Gila, the Gmug, the Manti La Salle. We could still get these implemented with some agency leadership and partner support and others, and then of course the other planning initiatives coming down the line. Next slide, please. We wanted to say that Wild and Scenic River Climate Refugia can be very diverse too. These are, Charles and I put up some pictures of forests we've been working on recently. You know, up there, the Bridger Teton National Forest, down here, the Manti La Salle National Forest. They make up all of these photos. And the Climate Refugia that could be cataloged for these vary a lot. Some of it could be connectivity for habitat migration, could be persistent cold water for endangered fish or endangered salamanders, or breeding habitat for a mammal, or important migratory bird habitat that will persist long into a warming, drying world. They can have unique, sometimes rare and endangered plant species or cover. And they can also be areas of cultural importance. You know, a lot of our riverine areas have held cultural importance for millennia. And unfortunately, a number of these areas are going to be impacted and perhaps even destroyed under an altered climate scenario. But some will persist. And those areas that do deserve to be protected under Climate Refugia ORV. Next slide, please. We wanted to kick off some questions for discussion, and I can pose the first one, and then we'll jump off into the discussion. So, and of course, you can ask your own questions. We just wanted to make sure that there wasn't any silence in the room. But in your views, what are some of the impediments to adoption of a Climate Refugia ORV? What are you curious about? What didn't we cover? What can we help answer? And then I might as well read the other one too. What can NGOs such as ourselves, Greater Yellowstone Coalition, American Rivers, and a bunch of you other folks on the call. What can we do to help agencies adopt climate refugia ORVs? Thanks.
And we'd love for you to hear from you. You're welcome to put things in the chat and we can read those out. Also, down on your little Zoom toolbar, you'll see a button that says reactions. And if you click that, there's an option to raise your hand and we can call on you.
I have a question, Mike. This is James Major. So some of the targets for the ORVs, is this retroactive? So are you looking at already, like rivers already designated that have the ORVs listed and going back and like looking at the ORVs and seeing which ones sort of like already have the Refugia language in there? So like, so you have like hydrology and fisheries or ecology as some of the ORVs that already are existing on these designated rivers. With these, cold water areas and good gravel and persistent cold water coming from the stream bed and stuff like that. So is this a retroactive thing, or is it only looking at like rivers that are eligible and suitable going forward?
That's a great question, James. And I think Charles and I view this as something that could be retroactive, especially as we start revising existing comprehensive river management plans, or in a lot of cases, a lot of our designated rivers don't really even have CRMPs yet. But I think you're absolutely right. We don't need to. I think one of the hallmarks of being good public lands managers is adjusting to changing times and emerging science. And as we start revising or creating these CRMPs, we should be able to add climate refugia to them. Charles, you got anything to add to that?
I just agree. Yeah, I think there's an opportunity to be retroactive. Thanks for the question, James. Most of the work that we've done has been trying to be proactive with eligibility, suitability, but yeah, there's great opportunity otherwise.
Scott, I see your hand up. Go ahead. You are still muted, Scott.
Thank you. Once we get the first climate refugia ORV on a river, what do you see as an example of a management framework or a specific management action that fits the protect and enhance standard for that? In other words, how does the rubber hit the road?
I can jump in, and then Charles, you wanna add to. So you're thinking, Scott, you're asking what are specific management standards that we could have? And we hope that this is a discussion too, so we might have to go back and forth on this one a little bit. But I think with the flexible nature of potential climate refugia ORVs, it would have to, of course, be tailored to each individual piece that goes into that climate refugia ORV. For instance, if we take climate refugia based on the climate shield data of cold water, non-hybridization, cold water and genetic persistence of native trout species. I think we can look at some of the management standards that would have to go into that. So for instance, cold water refugia are maintained by a number of things. They're maintained by active upland or protected upland areas, old growth, upland shaded snow sheds, intact riparian areas to keep rivers cool, groundwater infiltration and protection of groundwater resources for spring recharge, to name a few. So you wouldn't want any standards that could impact, or any projects that could impact any of those things, whether it's a forestry project, whether it's drilling that could impact groundwater resources, whether it's so forth. I mean, we could dive into that. The genetic purity for the native fish might be it might be something that we require a fish habitat barrier down low to protect. It might be another way that we could protect those, but I think we'd have to go through examples to really suss those out, and they could get really complicated. I mean, it could be difficult to make these management prescriptions both detailed enough to be meaningful, and also actionable at the scale of the forest. But we've done more difficult things in the past. So does that help? And Charles, feel free to add.
Yeah, that helps, and that gets at why I was asking the question is, this is an ORV that, to be protective of, reaches beyond the river and is designated corridor, right? So you're having to look at things, far away from the river, like you mentioned, including meadows and upland forests, which just kind of brings a broader view of what's needed to manage a river for its ORVs. I happen to live on a river that fits this paradigm exactly. We have a pure wild fish genetic and a spring Chinook salmon that exists practically only in this one river now as a remnant population. And the life history of that fish, they spend their adult life, their final year, in the river through the summer when temperatures are high, and rely on thermal refugia within the river for their survival. So I'm thinking of what actions may go into a CRMP, or in the case of this river, it's a 2A2 designation. It's just the forest plan functions as the CRMP. What would be in there that would guide, in this case, Forest Service management to be protective of that? I think the examples you gave fit really well.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And this would have to be tailored to each individual situation. We probably have a number of designations where looking at ridgetop to ridgetop or larger watershed values to maintain climate refugia ORV would be possible for a land management agency. And then we have some places where that's not possible just because of overlaying different land ownership, different conditions on the ground, and we'd have to be flexible and adjust to each of those.
Yes, great question, Scott. I'd like to take a moment to just recap some comments that have been shared in the chat for those who might be joining via phone. Rachel said, I think another aspect to reiterate that is different and important in terms of increasing what would qualify as an ORV is the suggested change in region of comparison. And then Sarah said, another path to implementation of climate refugia management, if the ORVs and CRMPs are already established or aren't ripe for revision, is updating a river's monitoring plan separate from an entire CRMP revision to include more climate monitoring and triggers for management in relation to each established ORV. And we are currently in this process on the Santa Fe National Forest, and we're hoping it will bolster climate refugia protection, even if it's not labeled as its own specific ORV.
That's excellent, Sarah. Great idea. And the Santa Fe needs it. It's awesome.
And then Eric mentioned one angle we're exploring, given agencies' reluctance to do climate refugia as an ORV, is to have it hardwired into the bill text or in the congressional record. And Eric asked, has anyone else had luck with this approach for climate refugia or any other ORV? So feel free to contribute in the chat if you have had luck with that approach. And then Christopher asked, would you please share more of your thoughts about how the bar might be set for what is a climate refugia ORV versus RRV? And Christopher, I'm not sure what you mean by RRV, so maybe you could clarify that acronym. I'm thinking like river related value, but that's just.
That was my guess, but it'd be nice to hear what Christopher thinks.
River related value.
Awesome. Well, Charles, feel free to grab any of those. I'll just say to Eric Fernandez from Oregon Wild, oftentimes ORVs aren't of course included in bill text or language. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're included in, or at least there's a nod given in findings for the congressional record. Sometimes those get stripped. But it's an interesting suggestion, and it would be a way to legislate a value like that. I think I'd in deference to our agency partners that I'm sure are on this call. I mean, we just addressed Sarah's comment a second ago. We'd hope that that wouldn't happen before agencies also got their guidance in place and got buy-in for implementation and so forth. But I think you bring up a good option.
Apologies for being in and out. My internet has been weak for the last few minutes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're a little garbled.
Okay. Just to that last comment. Okay, well, just to the last comment, I think that I would rather see deference paid to agencies in terms of the ORV and not seeing it in legislation. And I think that's just for setting a precedent for all ORVs, not just climate refugia. There was the comment about the RRV. I think climate refugia is a lot more specific, and it can be spelled out in the description beyond, what I've seen done most recently. And again, just nodding to Custer Gallatin National Forest for really providing a lot of detail as to how they're qualifying ORVs that are eligible. Just a lot of description and the generalized river related value. I hope that came through.
Yeah, that came through, Charles. And I think also, something you might be getting at, Christopher, is, what for climate refugia in a river corridor, what's the bar for whether it's river related or not? Maybe that's what you're asking. Say if we're talking about watershed health and snow sheds and so forth. I think there could be guidance in there to draw a direct line to the climate refugia value, say temperature, persistence, flow, so forth. Even if sometimes those are unknown or tenuous, we don't know that every for instance, groundwater mapping, right? Groundwater mapping is notoriously difficult. We don't know that every drop that falls in an infiltration zone will in fact go into the groundwater, seep or spring, but we know that groundwater pumped out or prevented from infiltrating there definitely won't. So we're a little better about identifying potential harms than we are on proactively protecting some of these things. There's going to be some ambiguity that we will have to work through with some of this.
Yeah, Joe, go ahead.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, thank you, Mike and Charles, for this presentation. I want to address your questions. So I think the main impediment to adopting this ORV is the fact that climate refugia is sort of a concept and it's a process that's based on a number of variables and assumptions that we have no precedent for in terms of measuring them. Whereas the other ORVs like ecology or, fish, wildlife, recreation, etc., those are quantifiable metrics with like identifiable points in the landscape that have, tangible value. And so going forward, I think if you're going to get any traction with attempting to get recognition of a process-based ORV rather than a site-specific ORV, you need to think about developing some sort of criteria for weighing the relative contribution of any given suite of resources towards climate refugia, so that you can convincingly say that one stream provides climate refugia while the other doesn't. And that's going to be really difficult because there's so many unknowns going forward, and we're likely to enter a period where kind of anomalous communities develop in the landscape, plant communities or ecological interactions that there's no historical precedent for. And so I just see that as the challenging argument to make to the agencies, which are really intransigent when it comes to, or they can be intransigent when it comes to adopting really sort of, progressive concepts in land management.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Appreciate that. And yeah, the complexity is high, right? By nature,
Joe.
climate refugia ORV will require larger data sets and larger data aggregations, probably than we've had access to until the last couple decades. That said, we do have access to them now, and hopefully that trend will continue. I'm thinking of newer technologies like eDNA and eRNA and LiDAR and a number of other kind of big data sets that we're now looking for to inform land management. Thanks.
Joe, are you able to hear me right now? This is Charles.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, I just want to play a little devil's advocate with you and say that there is data that's quantitative. We have
Oh, Charles,
the
you
cold
cut out.
water collar. We have collar data on big game ungulates, and that can include how much time they're spending in these riparian corridors that are deemed climate refugia. I totally respect your point, and I agree that we need criteria. And I look to work with all of you to develop that criteria, including agencies. I do feel like we are at a point where there is applicable data to support this climate refugia ORV. It's going to be context dependent in different geographies. But thank you for bringing that up.
And I think we have time for one last question. So Gary, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. My question on this has to do with management. I mean, an outstanding, remarkable value, basically a designation is a baseline for certain properties on the river, and the management plan has got to maintain, it's a non-degradation or improvement thing. So on climate refugia, let's suppose that we see a deterioration in the baseline conditions. What can a management plan do? How can a management plan affect a problem that is basically global and just grossly exceeds the boundaries of this wild and scenic river? So I'm just getting a really practical examination. I love the idea, but how could we use it to make a difference?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Appreciate it. And I see Dave's got his hand up too. And it'd be great, Angie, if we have time to hear from Dave, a brave agency official that wants to ask a question too. Thanks for your question, Gary. And again, it's complicated and depends on each climate refugia ORV. But I think that we can identify, and that could be identified in planning, standards and guidance that could set thresholds for each component of, say, a climate refugia ORV, whether it's a migration corridor, whether it's persistent cold water qualities that will persist to 2040. I think, like Charles and I have said earlier, it's not going to be easy, but we think that the data is there and that you can walk the causal chain back to get real standards put into planning for persistence of those values. And as you point out, I mean, this is a global condition. We're learning more about it every day. Downscaled climate data is notoriously difficult to get down to the granularity we might need for some of this stuff, but it's getting better. And in a sense, if we go back to the precautionary principle, we're trying to set standards for the persistence of values that already exist, right? Like, we don't know what the future is going to throw at us exactly, other than it's going to be hotter, drier, flashier, in some ways, greater floods, greater droughts, so forth. But we know what makes values resilient over the long term, and we know what harms those. So there's a bit of locus of control stuff here too, right? There are some things that we control and some that don't, but hopefully there are enough that we can control that we could make management standards out of them. Thanks.
And Dave, go ahead and our last question.
Okay. Not as much a question as just saying, what should you be doing? How's this happen? Both you guys are doing this. I think it's probably 3 or 4 years ago that you brought in a term to my office that I hadn't heard before, climate refugia. I kind of just nodded and acted like I knew what you're talking about, so I didn't look stupid. But you kind of made this a national term. It's been in meetings. It's been in front of the Wild and Scenic Coordinating Council. You're making this happen across the country, and you're getting it there. Somebody's gonna fall and just make that dive into another ORV that's not listed in the act. It's getting closer by the minute. What we're dealing with is the act saying you can do it, but agency saying I'm not sure we can do that, and if we do that, we need to have a bureaucratic process possibly to make this possible. I think it can happen. I think a lot of people are trying to get to climate refugia. One of the things we're doing actively by having great partners like the Snake River Fund and Teton Conservation District is we're getting more gauges in, and we're putting thermometers on them, so we can actually be tracking the temperatures that are going on with our wild and scenic rivers. And that's doesn't sound like much, but it's a start that we can now know what's going on and have a direct correlation. The state can see it, anybody can see it, and it's not much, but it's possible. It's possible to help us get to where we're going on this stuff. So thank you guys for putting this on today and making this a national issue. That's all I got.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave, and thanks for your work on the Bridger Teton and yeah, temperature data. I mean, data is power, right? And and that's part of what we're talking about with some of this. And some of this might take infrastructure funding and on other pieces in the future too. But if we can measure it, we can usually find a signal that affects that measurement. So thanks.
Well, I would just like to thank both Mike and Charles again for joining us today, bringing up this topic. Thank all of you for joining us for the conversation. We will be posting this on our YouTube channel. I put the link in there. Subscribe and you'll stay up to date with new videos as we post them. Also, A couple things coming up. We will be sending out a survey to all of you who've registered today, to RMS members about future topics for river management roundtables. So keep an eye out for that. And we'd love to hear from you about what's important to you so that we can discuss that and help problem solve and get into some of these bigger concept topics. And as a reminder, we've got our River Management Symposium coming up in February, at the end of February in San Antonio. We hope to see you there. Our early registration ends January 28th. So I really encourage you to register before then. You'll get a little bit of a cheaper price. And then lastly, we have a survey that I'd like to share. I'll put a link in the chat and we'll also be sending this out afterwards. Would love to hear your thoughts on today's River Management Roundtable. So thank you all again. And again, big thanks to Charles and Mike for joining us today. And I'll be following up with an email with the link to the recording and some of the links and resources shared in the chat as well.